The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Natalie Hayes moved through the Cedar Creek Medical ICU at 11:33 p.m., her hand steady as she restocked the supply cart with practiced silence. The ward smelled like antiseptic and stale coffee, that particular exhaustion that clung to night shift the way wet scrubs clung to her ribs. She was invisible here, exactly how she preferred it. The kind of invisible that came from 3 years of night shifts, of never speaking unless spoken to, of making herself smaller than the competence she carried like a stone in her pocket. The tarnished military challenge coin pressed against her thigh through her scrub pocket as she moved. She didn't touch it anymore. Not at work. Not in daylight. That coin belonged to another life, one buried so deep that sometimes she forgot the smell of dust and diesel, the weight of someone else's blood on her hands, the names of the men she'd carried out of Helmand Province when everything went red and the extraction order never came. The Pentagon had been very clear 7 years ago: disappear into civilian life, change your name if you want, but understand this, officially, you do not exist. Master Chief Petty Officer Natalie Hayes was erased from every record that mattered. Now she was just a nurse. That's all she was allowed to be. Room 12 sat 3 doors down. She'd been assigned to him for the past 8 days, and she'd learned not to look at the name tattooed on his right forearm. General Marcus Hale. 4-star. Helmand Province, 2016. The name on his skin was hers, Hayes, in military block letters, the kind of ink that stayed permanent. He didn't remember her. The traumatic brain injury from the IED had stolen that along with 18 months of operational memories. He slept now, the ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm in the darkness, his vitals steady on the monitor, blood pressure 118/76, oxygen saturation 96%, heart rate 68. She checked the 4 ports, adjusted the blanket, and did not look at her name on his skin. That was the rule she'd made for herself. Look at the monitors. Look at the chart. Do not look at the proof. The nurse's station lay in the center of the ward, and that's where Dr. Whitfield stood at midnight, laughing with the residents in a way that made the fluorescent light seem harsher. He was tall, the kind of expensive looking that came from old money and an Ivy League nameplate, and his voice carried the particular confidence of someone who had never been told no. A betting board hung taped to the wall beside the coffee station, days written in marker, columns for each resident, tallies that tracked something Natalie understood without reading the fine print. How long until the new nurse quit? Whitfield's voice cut across the ward as she moved past with her restocking cart. 5 more days. That's my guess, he said to the 2 residents flanking him. Young guys, maybe 3 years out of medical school, their smirks sharp enough to draw blood. She's already starting to break. The way she flinches when I raise my voice. It's only a matter of time. They laughed. The kind of laughter that required an audience to feel solid. Natalie didn't break stride. Her jaw clenched, just the smallest tension in the hinge of her teeth, and she continued moving the cart toward the medication storage area. Pain was information. Humiliation was just data. She'd learned that in places where your call sign meant more than your first name, where weakness was the kind of mistake that got people killed. A man's laughter behind you meant nothing. A man's laughter meant he was still talking, still posturing, still safe. She pulled the patient charts from the afternoon shift and began cross-referencing the billing codes against the actual procedures documented. That was when she noticed it, a pattern in Dr. Whitfield's orders that didn't match the medical record. Phantom procedure codes. Charges for ultrasound guidance on procedures that didn't require it. Kickback pricing on supplies marked up 340% from their actual cost. She photographed the first 3 pages with her phone, quietly, without hesitation, and then slid the papers back into their slots. She was careful. She'd been trained to notice things, to catalog patterns, to see the spaces between what was written and what was true. Just a nurse asking questions about billing codes. Nothing alarming. Nothing that would trigger alarms. Except Dr. Whitfield had already seen her holding the charts. He appeared at the nurse's station at 12:38 a.m., his face dark in a way that made the resident stand very still. His voice came low and controlled, the kind of control that meant he'd practiced this before. Are you going through my patient charts? Not a question. A accusation with teeth. Routine double-check, Natalie said. Billing code seemed inconsistent with the documented procedures. Whitfield's face tightened. She'd made a mistake, not in the question, but in asking it aloud, in front of witnesses. He'd understood immediately that she was the kind of person who noticed things that other people missed. The kind of person who couldn't be manipulated into silence because silence wasn't her default. It was a chosen thing, a discipline. And disciplines could be undone. He stepped closer to the nurse's station and, in one deliberate motion, grabbed the stack of patient charts from her hands and hurled them across the tile floor. Papers scattered like wounded birds, white and pale blue, sliding under chairs and against the baseboards. Her charts. His rage. The message delivered to everyone watching. Pick that up, sweetheart. His voice was loud now, meant for the ward. Meant for the 2 residents who had stopped breathing. Meant for the other nurse, Diana, who was staring at her shoes suddenly very interested in the floor. And then we're going to have a conversation about your role here at Cedar Creek Medical. Natalie bent forward and began gathering the papers. She didn't flinch. She didn't flush. She didn't meet his eyes and she didn't look away either. She just moved with the quiet efficiency of someone doing a necessary task, her hand steady, her breathing even. The trembling wasn't fear. If there was trembling, it was restraint. The difference between a punch and a choice. Between shattering someone and walking away. She gathered the last page and stood. Whitfield was still watching her, and she saw the moment he realized she hadn't broken. No tears gathering in her eyes. No voice wavering. No apology or explanation. Just a nurse who'd picked up papers and was now moving toward the documentation station as if nothing had happened. As if his humiliation had landed on water instead of skin. The problem for Dr. Whitfield was that he'd just made a calculation that would change everything. He'd realized the only way to remove Natalie Hayes was to move faster than her questions. And the calculation he didn't make was that some people survived worse than this. Some people had held dying men in their arms in the dark. Some people had made decisions that cost other people their lives. Some people understood the weight of silence so completely that public shame became just another room to move through. The medication room at Cedar Creek Medical smelled like industrial alcohol and regret. Natalie restocked the 4 lines with mechanical precision, her hands moving through the same sequence they'd moved through for 3 weeks, Tuesday 2:22 a.m., fluorescent overheads humming their monotonous song, the night shift skeleton crew scattered across 12 patient floors. She didn't hear Whitfield enter. That was the problem. Good people announced themselves. He closed the door behind him. The click of the latch was louder than it should have been. Those billing codes you flagged. His voice carried the texture of someone accustomed to being obeyed. The ones you thought were suspicious. She continued organizing the shelf. Fentanyl. Midazolam. Lorazepam. Each vial in its place. That's above your pay grade, Hayes. Not her name. A statement of rank. Of the distance between them. Those codes are hospital policy. Approved by administration. When you start questioning them, you look like you don't understand your role here. Natalie turned to face him. Her expression didn't change. The line between her eyebrows didn't deepen. I'm double-checking billing against actual procedures provided. Room for 12 was billed for 2 chest x-rays. The imaging log shows 1. Whitfield stepped closer. His cologne arrived before his presence did, something that probably cost more than she made in a week. He smiled like a man who'd never been questioned about money in his life. The imaging log gets updated by residents who are too exhausted to remember what they had for breakfast. You're a nurse. You push medications. You don't audit billing systems. The audit trail is part of the chart. Is it? He leaned against the medication cart with the casual weight of someone who owned the space. Because I'm wondering if maybe your problem isn't the billing codes at all. Maybe your problem is that you don't know how to be part of a team. Maybe you're the kind of person who's always looking for problems instead of just doing her job. She turned back to the shelf. Her hands remained steady. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. Whitfield waited for a reaction. When none came, he pushed harder. When I call your references, I want to hear that you're reliable. Cooperative. Not someone who's going to spend her night shift playing detective. He paused. Let the silence work for him. We clear. Clear. He left. The door closed. The fluorescent hum continued. Natalie finished the restock. Counted the vials twice. The numbers were always exact when you paid attention. That's what military training taught you, precision under observation. The ability to move through an inspection knowing every detail was correct, every answer calibrated, every expression neutral enough to reveal nothing. 43 minutes later, she found Whitfield in the hallway outside the surgical supply closet. He was talking to a man she didn't recognize, tailored suit, expensive watch, the kind of careful grooming that suggested someone with a stake in outcomes. The supply rep she'd seen him before. Twice in the past week. Whitfield was sliding something into his jacket pocket. Not bulky. Envelope-shaped. The kind of thing that fit in a palm. The supply rep said something too quiet to hear. Whitfield laughed, genuine, relaxed, the sound of a transaction completed. Then the rep turned and walked toward the stairwell, and Whitfield adjusted his jacket and moved in the opposite direction without once looking at Natalie, though she was sure he knew she'd seen him. She continued toward room 407. Didn't pause. Didn't catalogue details. Didn't let her jaw clench or her hands curl into fists. The coin in her scrub pocket felt heavier than it should have, weighed down by the gravity of people who understood that witnessing something and reporting it were two very different things. The coin had been issued 17 years ago, stamped with a unit designation that officially no longer existed. Carrying it was a violation of her separation agreement. Noticing financial crime at a hospital that had taken a chance on hiring someone with her deliberately obscured employment history was a complication she couldn't afford. She checked the patients for rate. Adjusted the saline drip. Documented the vitals. Kept moving. By morning, the rumor was already spreading through the ICU with the efficiency of a virus. Natalie overheard it during shift change, Dr. Whitfield's voice in the attending's office, casual, concerned, the careful tone of someone who'd been rehearsing. Her employment history is spotty. Very spotty. 3 years unaccounted for. You don't see that on standard resumes unless there's something you're not supposed to know. Makes you wonder if there's a reason no one's ever heard of her before. The attending, Dr. Morrison, a competent physician and someone who followed hierarchy, made a non-committal sound. But she'd heard him. They'd all heard him. By noon, the residents were exchanging glances when Natalie entered a room. By evening, the nursing supervisor had requested clarification about her background. By 8:13 p.m., the phone call came. HR wanted to discuss concerns regarding her suitability for the ICU environment. Whitfield sat in his office reviewing patient charts, the afternoon light slanting across his desk in a way that suggested he hadn't yet realized he was already being hunted. The FBI agent who would eventually flip his entire financial arrangement sat in a field office 40 miles away, waiting for justification to open a file. But that was later. This was now. Natalie worked room 7. Room 9. Room 12, where General Marcus Hale slept beneath blankets that smelled like industrial detergent, his forearm bearing a name in permanent ink, a name he no longer connected to any face because a roadside explosive had fractured the pathways between memory and meaning. She changed his checked his vitals, did what she'd been trained to do, assess, document, move to the next task. Never asking the kinds of questions that might demand answers she wasn't prepared to give. The night shift continued the way all night shifts do, the slow accumulation of small decisions that never feel consequential until they're looked back on from the vantage point of ruin. And somewhere on the administrative floor, in an office with wood paneling and a degree from an Ivy League school, Dr. Whitfield was making phone calls. 3 of them. Each one designed to establish a narrative, build a foundation, create a record that would justify what was coming. The room went quiet. The kind of quiet that comes before something. It wasn't a request. It was a beginning. The monitors in room 12 started their descent at 0306 hours. One moment General Hale's rhythm displayed the steady climb and fall of a man sleeping through his recovery. The next moment, flatline. The ventilator continued its mechanical wheeze, but the heart monitor screamed its single continuous tone across the nurse's station, and Natalie didn't run. She moved. Walking past the two residents frozen at their workstations, past the call button they hadn't even thought to press yet, straight into the room where a 4-star general was dying. She assessed in 3 seconds. Pale skin going grey. Veins distended like rope at his neck. Breath sounds present but muffled. The man's chest rose and fell, but the air wasn't moving where it should. Not a rhythm problem. Pressure problem. Blood collecting in the pericardium, pressing against the heart like a fist closing around tissue paper, squeezing until the organ had no room left to beat. Acute tamponade. She'd drained 3 cases like this in the Helmand Province desert when the combat surgeon was 40 clicks out and the patient had maybe 6 minutes before system failure. Ultrasound machine. Now, she said, not to the resident specifically, but to the room itself. It wasn't a request. Command voice. The kind that came from 100 combat operations and had no room for hesitation. One of the residents jerked. Should we call? Cardiology is 20 minutes out. We don't have 20 minutes. Natalie was already moving to the bedside, gloved hand steady as she felt for landmarks on the patient's ribs, sternum, the space between the 5th and 6th intercostal. Spinal needle. 22 gauge. And get me the 3-way stopcock. Her voice had dropped an octave. It wasn't the voice of the night shift nurse who picked up charts without complaint. This was different. Sharper. Stripped of everything except necessity. The resident who'd been standing closest finally moved, returning with the ultrasound machine in 48 seconds, she counted without meaning to, another habit from another life. Natalie positioned the probe over the lower left chest, watching the grayscale image materialize on the screen. There. The pericardial sac, dark and distended, fluid-filled, the heart compressed against it like a fist in a balloon. She didn't explain what she was seeing. She just worked. Hand me the needle. The needle went in at the 5th intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, through the skin like it was part of her own body. No hesitation. No wobble. Muscle memory took over, the same precision she'd used threading catheters into soldiers' femoral arteries during medevac operations, the same steady pressure that had kept bleeding out to a minimum when there was no hospital for 60 miles and the closest help was a distant radio frequency. The needle slid deeper. 1 centimeter. 2. 3. Her hand knew exactly how far. The other resident was staring at her now, mouth open slightly, watching the transformation happening in real time. The timid nurse who'd gathered scattered charts without raising her voice had become something else entirely. The needle found fluid. The hiss of air escaping the syringe as blood flowed backward into the barrel, dark, oxygen-rich, the kind of blood that belonged inside a vein, not inside a pericardial sac. She drew it off steady and slow, watching the monitor. The heart rate began to climb. 40 beats per minute. 50. 60. The rhythm that had flatlined was returning, fragile at first, then stronger. The blood pressure displayed on the cuff cycled automatically. 40/20. 50/30. 68/42. Climbing. O2 sat, she asked. 75, the second resident reported, voice small and uncertain. Keep talking. 82. 88. 92. 96. Stable. She continued draining until the fluid slowed to a trickle, then secured the needle with tape and saline to prevent reaccumulation. The entire procedure had taken 6 minutes and 41 seconds. General Hale's pupils were reactive. His breathing had steadied. His skin was returning to something closer to normal color. Most importantly, his heart was beating without mechanical interference, doing the work it was designed to do when the pressure wasn't crushing it flat. Natalie stepped back from the bedside and pulled off her gloves. The fluorescent lights above hummed their constant frequency. Somewhere in the distance, a code cart was being moved down another corridor. Nothing about the hospital had changed. And everything had. General Hale's eyes opened. Not all the way, his brain was still floating on the edge of consciousness, still disconnected from months of traumatic brain injury. But they focused. He saw her. For just a moment, his gaze locked onto her face with the intensity of recognition, as if something deep in his injured mind had registered presence or memory or the shape of salvation standing over him. His lips moved but no sound came. Then his eyes drifted closed again, and he slipped back into the monitored sleep of the sedated and the recovering. Neither resident moved. They were both staring at Natalie now, not at the patient, and she could feel the weight of their attention like a physical thing. "What you just saw stays in this room," she said quietly, turning toward the door. "No text messages. No social media. No speculation about who I am or what just happened here. It wasn't a threat. It was something else. Authority. The kind that comes from having already survived impossible things." "What? How did you?" The first resident was struggling for words. "That was... I've never seen anyone move like that. The precision, the confidence. The way you just knew exactly what to do before cardiology even." "Experience," Natalie cut him off. She was already moving toward the vital signs monitor, documenting the procedure with clinical precision. Her handwriting was steady. Her mind had already compartmentalized the combat muscle memory that had taken over during the pericardiocentesis, locked it back into the vault where it belonged. Extended ICU rotation at a level 1 trauma center. Saw a lot of tamponade cases. You pick up skills. It was a lie thin enough to see through if anyone looked too hard. But they wouldn't look. Not yet. She called cardiology herself to report the case, her voice back to its normal register, professional and measured. The attending surgeon who came in 36 minutes later after driving from his home in Buckhead found a stable patient, a completed emergency drainage, and documentation that attributed the procedure to the night shift nurse intervention understanding protocols. Cardiology confirmed the pericardial fluid was reaccumulating already, he'd need surgery within the week to fix the underlying bleed. But for now, the patient was alive. The patient's heart was beating. The patient had 6 more days. What happened next, Natalie didn't see coming. Not fully. Not in the way it mattered. She had 2 more hours on her shift when the first investigator arrived in the ICU at 0538 hours, badge visible, questions already forming on his face before he even found her restocking the medication cart in the hall outside General Hale's room. She knew something had shifted. She could feel it in the way the other nurses started avoiding eye contact. She could see it in the way the unit secretary suddenly looked very busy with her computer screen. Dr. Whitfield never appeared on the floor to congratulate her. That should have been her first real sign. By morning, the voicemail on Natalie's phone registered 7 new messages. She didn't listen to them. She already knew what was coming. The intercom crackled at 08 for 7 hours, a page for all night shift nurses to meet in conference room B at shift change. She clocked out at 0900 and walked down the corridor with the same measured pace she'd used for 12 years, the Special Forces challenge coin pressing against her ribs through her scrub pocket like a countdown timer. The conference room smelled of stale coffee and printed paper. Dr. Whitfield sat at the head of the table beside 2 board members she'd never seen before, their faces arranged in expressions of professional concern. A tablet was already queued up. On the screen, security footage of room 12, timestamp 0306 hours. Her hands entering the ultrasound probe. Her voice directing residents. The needle sliding between ribs with the kind of precision that didn't match just a night shift nurse. "This is a clear violation of protocol," Whitfield said, his voice carrying the satisfied hum of a man who had already won. "Unauthorized procedure." No surgeon present. No attending on site. She took it upon herself to perform an invasive cardiac intervention without proper authorization. The board members nodded, their attention carefully averted from her face. One of them slid a folder across the table. Your previous employment history has some concerning gaps, the woman said, not meeting her eyes. 7 years in a position with no contact information. A 3-year absence. No references available for several periods of your work history. Natalie had expected this. Whitfield had made the calls. The DoD had scrubbed her records, classified everything before 2015, sealed anything that mattered. Her cover had always been fragile, a tissue-thin civilian life built on a foundation of redacted documents and blank spaces. All he'd needed to do was pull on one thread. We've contacted Cedar Creek Medical's legal team and your previous employers, the man continued, sliding another document toward her. Conduct unbecoming. Insubordination. And now this, performing medical procedures outside your scope of practice. She didn't look at the papers. She already knew her name was on termination orders, already knew every word would be crafted to sound legitimate while saying nothing true. Additionally, the woman added, her tone taking on the rehearsed quality of prepared statements, we have statements from 2 residents indicating you instructed them to remain silent about the unauthorized procedure. That's tampering with hospital records. That's a serious matter. The lies were precise. The residents hadn't been instructed to remain silent, they'd been frozen in shock watching a woman perform emergency cardiothoracic intervention like someone reading a blueprint. But the narrative was already written. Whitfield had activated his network. The board members had their talking points. The investigators would follow, and they would find exactly what they'd been sent to find. I understand, Natalie said. Her voice carried no inflection, no defense, no plea. Just fact. Just acceptance. The silence that followed lasted exactly 2 seconds. You understand. The woman blinked. She had expected pushback, tears, a desperate explanation. Not this. Not the absolute calm of someone who had already walked through worse. The position is no longer sustainable, the man said, pushing the termination paperwork closer. We'll provide 2 weeks severance. Your final check will be mailed to your address on file. Natalie reached into her pocket and withdrew her hospital badge. It was worn, the laminate at the edges peeling slightly, her photo from 5 years ago showing a face that belonged to someone else. She placed it on the table with the same deliberation she might have used to lay down a weapon. My badge, she said. She stood. The chair scraped against tile with a sound like a ricochet. Whitfield's face had taken on a flush of something, not satisfaction exactly, but the glow of a man who had successfully eliminated a problem. She could see the calculation in his eyes, problem solved, audit trail covered, next victim identified. Security escorted her out at 0918 hours. 2 campus officers, young and uncomfortable, flanking her through the corridor like she had already become a cautionary tale. The nurses at the station watched with the careful expressions of people who had learned not to ask questions. One of them, a Marcus, who worked days and sometimes covered nights, started to say something, then stopped. Nobody wanted their name attached to whatever this was. Her locker was on the 3rd floor. She cleared it in 7 minutes, a spare uniform she'd never worn, a bottle of water, a hand cream she'd used once, a card from the pediatric floor thanking her for extra hours during flu season. And beneath it all, wrapped in a faded microfiber cloth, the tarnished challenge coin. The edges were worn smooth from 31 years of carried weight. One side bore the seal of Naval Special Warfare Command. The other side showed a call sign she hadn't spoken aloud in a decade. Reaper 6. She held it for a moment, the cold metal settling into her palm like an old argument she'd never resolved. Then she wrapped it again and pushed it into her jacket pocket. The parking garage smelled like concrete dust and gasoline. Her Honda was exactly where she'd left it, decade-old, silver paint faded to something the color of old bone, the back seat holding 3 cartons of belongings she'd never bothered to remove. She sat in the driver's seat and stared at the steering wheel. The key was in her hand. All she had to do was turn it. She tried at 0926. The engine clicked. Nothing else. She tried again at 0931. Click. Just that. Click like a tongue against teeth. Like the world saying no, not this, try harder, you're not done yet. She laid her forehead against the steering wheel and didn't move. The parking garage was cool and dim and absolutely silent except for the occasional sound of a car engine from the levels below. Her hands had stopped shaking 3 minutes into the termination meeting. Now they were just hands. Just flesh and bone and muscle memory that had no use. That had saved a 4-star general and failed to save herself. Maybe they were right. Maybe she didn't belong in that hospital. Maybe the DOD had been correct when they ordered her to disappear into civilian life, to erase herself so completely that even she couldn't find the person she'd been. Maybe sitting in a parking garage at 9:30 in the morning, unable to turn a key, was exactly what she deserved. She took out the challenge coin and looked at it in the dim light. The call sign caught the glint from the fluorescent panels above, Reaper 6. Operator. Rescuer. The woman who had carried wounded men across 4 miles of desert under fire, who had extracted 12 operators from a collapsing compound, who had been awarded commendations she could never display. All of that, all of it, erased on a Tuesday morning by a doctor with kickback schemes and a clipboard. Her thumb moved across the worn surface. Once. Twice. 3 times like a prayer or a counting exercise or a way to mark time that had stopped meaning anything at all. And then, at 0943 hours, she heard it. Distant at first. A sound that didn't belong in a parking garage. A sound like the air itself was being beaten into submission. A rhythmic percussion that grew louder, closer, until the concrete beneath her car seemed to vibrate with intention. She looked up through the garage's opening to the sky above the hospital. 2 UH-60M Black Hawk helicopters descended toward Cedar Creek Medical's rooftop helipad, their rotors cutting the morning air like blades through silk. The sound was unmistakable. She'd last heard it in Helmand Province, last felt that signature beat in her bones during extraction ops that the government had deemed too sensitive for any official record. The helicopters settled onto the pad with the practiced ease of pilots who had done this before, somewhere else, under conditions that usually involved gunfire. She was still sitting in her car, forehead against the steering wheel, when her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number, Cedar Creek Medical Lobby. 5 minutes. The general is awake. The ones who've seen the worst often give the most. That was supposed to be a closing statement, an ending. But she already knew better. Her life had ended once, officially, when the Pentagon classified her name and ordered her to vanish. Sometimes a second ending turned into a doorway instead. The key turned on the first try. The engine roared to life like it had been waiting all along. The rotor wash hit the helipad at Cedar Creek Medical like a physical force, concrete vibrating beneath boots that weren't hospital staff. The Black Hawk descended through Atlanta's humid afternoon, its shadow swallowing the rooftop hole, and security personnel backed away instinctively, the kind of respect that comes from not understanding what you're looking at. For men in dress uniforms moved down the stairwell with the synchronized precision of operators executing a known plan. Their uniforms carried insignia that made administrators step aside without being asked. One of them, a colonel with silver eagles on his collar and decoration spanning his chest, walked directly past the ER director into the main corridor, past the nurses' station where machines beeped their endless arithmetic, his eyes scanning faces like he was reading names off a roster. Reaper 6, he said to the first nurse who made eye contact. Not a question. A location request. Nobody knew who Reaper 6 was. That was the point. The hospital administrator, Harold Chen, appeared within 3 minutes of security calling upstairs. Federal presence on the rooftop did that to chain of command. The colonel showed him a document that made Chen's face drain of color. The nurse you terminated last week. Master Chief Petty Officer Natalie Hayes. Where is she? Not a question. A command. The uniform had spoken. The hospital moved. They found her in the parking garage on the third level down, in the same 2004 Honda Civic that had become her second address. She sat with both hands on the steering wheel, having returned to this exact spot every morning for 7 days, a habit born from muscle memory, the body returning to where it had last been ordered to be. The engine was off. The key sat unused in the ignition. Her eyes were closed. When Chen knocked on the driver's window, she opened them without flinching, as if she'd been expecting this exact interruption, in this exact location, at this exact moment in time. "Ms. Hayes. You're needed upstairs." Chen's voice carried something between apology and command. Behind him stood hospital security, and behind security stood the edge of something larger, something that made the fluorescent parking structure lights seem impossibly small. She didn't ask questions. She grabbed the tarnished challenge coin from the center console, the only physical proof that Reaper 6 had ever existed, and followed Chen back through the garage, up the elevator, down the corridor where orderlies moved aside without being told why, into a conference room where the colonel stood beside Dr. Whitfield. The doctor's face had gone the color of old surgical gauze. His hands trembled in a way that Natalie's never had, not even when she was carrying wounded through Helmand Province with bullets snapping past like angry hornets. The colonel opened a classified file on the table. His voice cut through the silence like a surgical instrument finding its target. Master Chief Petty Officer Natalie Hayes. Navy Cross recipient. 17 combat deployments. Credited with extracting 43 military personnel from hostile territory, including the man in ICU Room 12. Your identity was buried by the Department of Defense following Operation Mountain Shadow in 2016. You were ordered to disappear into civilian life. Nobody was supposed to know what you are. He paused. Everyone in this room now knows. That changes nothing and everything. The door opened. General Marcus Hale stood in a pressed Army service uniform, his left arm exposed, the sleeve rolled back past his shoulder. Her name was there, inked permanently into his forearm in military block letters, Hayes. His voice, when he spoke, carried the careful precision of a man whose brain had been reassembled piece by piece through her hands. 7 miles. That's how far you carried me that night. You and 2 others. Our position got overrun. Everyone else? He stopped. Swallowed. There were 13 of us that morning. You brought out 3. Me and Petty Officers Rodriguez and Chen. The rest didn't make it. His eyes found hers. I would have died in that compound if you hadn't come back through that door with a rifle you'd taken off a dead Taliban operative and a field expedient tourniquet made from a strip of your uniform. The room went absolutely silent. Not the silence of quiet, the silence of the world holding its breath. You were shot twice that night, the general continued. Shoulder and hip. You never mentioned it until you got us to the extraction point for miles away. Handed us to the QRF and walked backward covering our withdrawal while bleeding through both sides of your uniform. His hand opened. The challenge coin Natalie had carried rested in his palm, weathered and dented from impact, the same coin he'd given her that desert night before everything went wrong. I've carried this for 8 years. Trying to remember your face because the TBI took most of that night away from me. But I never forgot what you did. Whitfield's chair scraped backward. I don't care what's a military, the door opened again. 2 federal agents, their badges catching the fluorescent light, stepped forward with the deliberate slowness of people about to change someone's entire existence. The lead agent, a woman with grey streaking her hair and the kind of eyes that had seen every excuse a person could manufacture, approached the doctor with handcuffs visible at her belt. Dr. David Whitfield, we have a federal warrant for your arrest related to identity fraud, falsification of personnel records, and obstruction of a federal investigation. You attempted to forge Master Chief Petty Officer Hayes' employment file to justify her termination. That single action triggered digital alarms at the Department of Justice. When we pulled the thread, your entire operation unraveled. Insurance fraud totaling $3.2 million over 36 months. Kickback arrangements with MedSupply Solutions. Phantom procedures billed to Medicare. She read him his rights in a voice that had recited these words countless times to countless men who'd thought themselves untouchable. Whitfield's mouth opened. Closed. His hands went to his chest, and for a moment it looked like he might claim a heart attack, might perform his own medical emergency and become his own patient. Instead, he tried to run. 3 steps toward the conference room door before the second agent stepped in front of him. The struggle lasted exactly 4 seconds. Then his hands were behind his back, metal clicking around his wrists with a sound like a gun safety being disengaged. They walked him out past the nurse's station where Natalie stood flanked by the 4 operators from the Black Hawk. The staff of Cedar Creek Medical ICU stopped moving. Stopped breathing. Stopped everything. They watched Dr. Whitfield pass in handcuffs, his face the color of old bone, and they watched Natalie Hayes stand in the center of their chaos wearing the same scrubs she'd worn all week, wearing the same composure she'd worn through 7 days of returning to a parking garage out of habit. But something fundamental had shifted. The woman they'd watched be humiliated, be dismissed, be erased, that woman was no longer there. In her place stood someone else entirely. Someone whose presence made the air pressure change. The colonel stepped forward. His voice carried the weight of institutional authority and something deeper, recognition earned through survival. Master Chief, we'd like to discuss a position. Fort Bragg. Medical Training Command. We need someone who can teach our medics what you already know. How to keep warriors alive when everything wants them dead. He paused. How to lead when everyone's falling apart. Natalie looked at the general. At the coin in his outstretched hand. At the operators who'd flown across the country to bring her home. Her voice, when it came, was different from the voice that had apologized to Dr. Whitfield. Lower. Steadier. Command authority wrapped in 2 words, I accept. The rotor wash hit the helipad again as she climbed into the Black Hawk beside the general, the challenge coin now resting in her palm where it belonged. Below them, Atlanta's sprawl stretched out like a map of a life she no longer had to hide. The ones who have seen the worst often give the most. Subscribe for more stories of buried heroes and the moments that bring them home.